Final Fantasy X is, without a doubt, a fantastic game. And one of the main reasons is because of just how connected everything was. This notion permeated through almost every single aspect of the game, from the narrative, the various mechanics, such as summoners not being able to use the same summon in battle as someone else, and even the progression system where every single character was connected via the sphere grid. But perhaps one of the most interesting examples of this notion can be found when looking at the building blocks of two characters who were central to the plot, Seymour and Yuna. Their respective backstories had so many layers of depth, but to understand more about why the connection between these two characters even exists in the first place, it's important to look at how the game was created. When planning was underway for Final Fantasy X, Yoshinori Kitase and his team had initially settled upon a rather unique concept that was quite different from what we had seen before within the franchise. It would see the game's narrative based around the number 17, and this would manifest by having individuals throughout the world die once they became 17 years old. It was intended to be a fate that would affect everyone, acting as a unique connection, something akin to a shared tragedy, and the idea was that it would place a spotlight on what people would do with the limited time they had.
The resolution is a celebration of life. It allows us to end our lives with dignity.
A celebration of life. Sounds very noble, very caring.
As time passed, the scenario team decided to move away from using the explicit details they had initially explored, instead choosing to rework wider parts of the concept into their new vision for what Final Fantasy X should be. It's why Tidus and Yuna, who were present for that earlier concept, are still 17 years old during the events of Final Fantasy X, and we can also assume it's why Yuna's story still revolves around the notion of her life ending at that tender age. It could also be why sin exists, as it continues along with the theme of shared tragedy. People may not specifically die when they turn 17 anymore, but due to the presence of sin, they could still die at any time, and it's a fate that could affect a significant portion of the population. It gave everyone a unique connection, but the notion of connectivity and shared tragedy permeated into numerous aspects of the game in both rather blatant and more subtle ways. This is highlighted when looking at the main cast of characters. Whereas in previous games, where the majority of party members often had no knowledge of each other prior to their fateful encounters and only joined together after realizing they had a mutual enemy or shared goal, within Final Fantasy X, this wasn't the case. Yuna had long-standing relationships with Kamari, Waka and Lulu before the game even began. She also had a very real connection with Riku, who was her cousin, Orin was her father's guardian, and Tidus was the son of her father's other guardian, Jecht. She was connected in a meaningful way to every other main protagonist, acting as the linchpin of the group. But perhaps the most interesting aspect is that this notion of connectivity to Yuna extended beyond the protagonists, and the best example of this comes when looking at the intriguing similarities and differences that exist between Yuna and Seymour Guado. When Seymour was first introduced in Luca, on face value it would appear as though he had almost no connection to Yuna outside of their common affiliation with Yevon. And this was the case when comparing the two characters from both a visual perspective, but also their assumed standing within Spira. Seymour was tall and imposing, and held status as a Maester of Yevon, something which gave him much fame and respect throughout Spira. Yuna, on the other hand, was presented as almost the exact opposite. She was small in frame and unassuming, only holding the position of a novice summoner. She did have some fame amongst the land, but this was only due to how much her father was revered, as opposed to anything she had specifically done herself. These initial impressions were designed to be contrasting, but as the game divulged more information about their respective pasts, clear similarities were disclosed. It saw Seymour and Yuna tied together by a form of shared tragedy, but Seymour's version of this tragedy was often far more severe or juxtaposed when compared to Yuna's, and neither of them ever really knew that the other had been through similar trials throughout their formative years. Perhaps the most obvious similarity is that unlike many of the other denizens of Spira, both Seymour and Yuna were mixed race. Seymour was half human and half Guado, and Yuna was half human, half Elbed. Their births both came following attempts by their parents to bridge gaps that existed between the various factions of Spira. Their hope was that by showing that successful unions could exist, tensions would soften. Yet even though there were good intentions, each instance caused much anger, albeit for different reasons. In the case of Seymour, his father, Jyscal Guado, had entered into a relationship with a human woman, hoping it would help his people to become more accepted. This relationship was tolerated, but the birth of their child was not well received, and Seymour was regarded as an impure abomination due to the amalgamation of features he exhibited from both races. Yuna's birth didn't quite receive as much vitriol, but the relationship between her parents did. Braska and his Albert partner, who happened to be Cid's sister, had married in secret, and when both parties found out, they were appalled. Yevon punished Braska by throwing him out of the clergy, and Cid exiled his sister, disowning her. When Yuna was born, it was warmly received by both parties, and the wounds did start to mend over time, but the damage of their previous actions had not been forgotten. It meant that when they were both young, Seymour and Yuna had an isolated view of the world. The only real acceptance they received came from their parents, as nobody else was overly approving of their existence. But to their credit, both sets of parents did attempt to change this, even though the results were quite severe. Throughout his earlier life, Seymour was able to live with the Guado, but his presence led to constant unrest, and this was something which only intensified after his father became the leader of the Guado. Jyscal was able to hold off the scrutiny about his son for a time, but after 8 years the Guado had exhausted their tolerance, and there was a very real possibility that they would rise up against Jyscal unless he did something. And so, to appease the masses, Jyscal decided to exile his wife and son. Publicly, it was claimed that Seymour needed isolation so that he could focus on becoming a summoner, with Jyscal proclaiming that his son would become a beacon of hope for Yevon. But the reality was all too clear. Seymour and his mother were sent to Barge Temple when he was only 8 years old. They had been banished from civilization due to hatred for what he was. He would no longer have a father, and the Guado were glad to be rid of him. In the case of Yuna, after living for a few years in Bavel, her mother decided to visit the Albed, hoping to reconcile, but she was killed by Sin en route. This event led Braska down a new path, one that would see him abandon his only daughter, as he hoped to defeat Sin so that nobody else would feel pain and suffering at its hands again. Upon his success, Yuna was left with no parents, but was found by Kamari and taken to Besaid when she was only 7 years old. Here, despite the temple town being very much pro-Yevon and very much anti-Albed, she was raised as one of their own due to nobody knowing about her mixed heritage. In their new locations, Seymour and Yuna settled into their new lives. Seymour trained hard with his mother, never having any friends or being part of something bigger, and to make matters worse, Seymour's mother was dying during this time. Realizing that she had little time left, she pushed Seymour to undergo his pilgrimage so that she could become his final Aeon. Yet when the time came and the sacrifice had been made, Seymour chose not to fight Sin, instead returning to Barge Temple to live alone in isolation. Yuna's new life though was rather different. With Kamari watching over her, much as Seymour's mother had done for him, Yuna got to enjoy her childhood, becoming part of a close-knit community and making lifelong friends who would stick with her no matter what perils she would face. It meant that before Seymour and Yuna were even teenagers, their lives had suffered significant disruption. Both had essentially been left with no parents, if we consider Seymour's father very much out of reach, and they were forced to leave the place they called home. But after some time, they gained a sense of stability. This stability led to them contemplating what they wanted from life, and they both settled upon the same objective. They wanted to defeat Sin. Yet while Yuna wanted to follow in her father's footsteps, hoping that defeating Sin would prevent it from coming back, Seymour wanted to defeat Sin so that he could become Sin. They both wanted to end suffering, they just had different viewpoints as to how it could be achieved, and this was due to the rather contrasting experiences that followed that initial change of environment. What's interesting though is that despite the clear separation, they both followed the same initial path. Seymour was pushed into being a summoner by his parents, and Yuna, unable to shake the feeling of wanting something more, decided to follow in her father's footsteps by also choosing to become a summoner. Throughout their respective pilgrimages, they both received support from their families. Seymour had his mother as his guardian, and Jyscal supported them from afar in private. Yuna also had her numerous surrogate family members in Kamari, Waka, Lulu, and then Oren. When the time came, they both chose to reject the final Aeon, but here is where their paths diverged, as Yuna decided to carry on the fight. While Seymour lost his belief and fell into despair due to his isolation, Yuna kept hers due to the support and encouragement of her friends. It meant that when Seymour's exile ended, he was a shadow of the boy who had left 10 years prior. He supported his father, who had become a maester of Yevon, but only so that he could further his nihilistic plans. And so, after waiting and working his way up the ladder within Yevon, Seymour murdered his father, assuming his position and latching onto Yuna as the summoner who he believed could help him to achieve his goals. It was rather fitting that two characters who were similar in so many ways, who had that connection through the various tragedies that they had suffered, would end up on opposite sides of the fight. There were of course many reasons why this happened, but it's difficult to ignore how different things could have been had the Guado just accepted Seymour for who he was earlier in his life. If Yuna had suffered the same resentment from the people of Besaid, who knows how she would have turned out, but ultimately they accepted her, even though they theoretically should have hated her. Perhaps if they'd learnt more about their respective childhoods, Seymour could have been saved from his unfortunate plight, and I think that that's part of what Yuna was attempting to do when, against the wishes of her group, she agreed to meet with Seymour at Macalania. But despite her noble actions, Yuna learnt that sometimes people have fallen too far to be saved, and in the case of Seymour, that was only too clear. You could also draw parallels between Seymour and Tidus too, especially when looking at the relationship they had with their respective fathers. Tidus loathed his father, and it's easy to see how he could have gone down the same dark path, but he benefited from having Oren there to guide him, and even though he did still end up killing his father, he was able to forgive him beforehand. Either way, I think the concept of connectivity is such an interesting one within the context of Final Fantasy X. This is just one particular example, but as I mentioned in the introduction, it could be explored in so many different ways, and I hope you found this particular example very interesting. If you did, then please hit that like button, share this video around, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to say a big thank you to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.